My parking ticket was a nuisance, but Judge Caprio's courtroom promised a viral moment. I never imagined that moment would involve the city's police chief, a drug cartel, and a shocking web of family corruption. So, there I was, sitting on a hard wooden bench in the Providence Municipal Court, my palms sweating. The offense? A $25 parking ticket. I'd parked in a spot that apparently became a loading zone from 2 p.m. to 4 p.m. on alternating Tuesdays of months with an R in them, or something equally ridiculous. Normally, I'd just pay it, but I was broke, and honestly, I was kind of excited. This was Judge Caprio's courtroom. I'd seen the videos, the viral clips of the kind, elderly judge with a heart of gold. I was hoping for a little bit of that TV magic, maybe a heartwarming story, and a dismissal. The air in the courtroom was thick with a mixture of cheap cologne, anxiety, and the faint, dusty smell of old paper. People from all walks of life were there, shifting uncomfortably, their faces a gallery of worry and resignation. After a few routine cases, a speeding ticket for a nursing student, a rolling stop for a construction worker, all handled with Caprio's signature blend of fatherly wisdom and judicial authority, the clerk called the next name, Blake Henderson. A young man, probably in his early 20s, swaggered to the front. He was dressed in clothes that cost more than my car, designer jeans, a crisp white shirt under a ridiculously expensive-looking jacket, and sneakers that looked like they'd never touched actual pavement. He had a smirk plastered on his face, the kind of look that says, "I own this place, and everyone in it." He didn't stand at the defendant's podium. He leaned on it, one hand in his pocket, as if he were waiting for a barista to call his latte order. Judge Caprio peered over his glasses, his expression unreadable. "Mr. Henderson, you have quite the list here. Speeding 30 miles over the limit in a school zone. Failure to stop at a red light. And reckless driving. That's a serious combination, son." The judge's tone was gentle but firm. It was the voice he used when he was giving someone a chance to explain themselves, a chance to show some remorse. Blake, however, wasn't taking the hint. He let out a short, humorless laugh. "Look, Your Honor," he said, the title dripping with sarcasm. "I was in a hurry. Places to be. You know how it is." The entire room seemed to tense up. You just didn't talk to Judge Caprio like that. It was like kicking a puppy in front of a crowd. The judge's smile didn't falter, but his eyes hardened slightly. "I see. And were the children in this school zone also in a hurry? A hurry to get out of your way, perhaps?" The gallery murmured in agreement. My own minor parking ticket felt a million miles away. This was real drama. Blake rolled his eyes so dramatically I thought they might fall out of his head. "Come on, old man. There were no kids around. It was after hours. Can we just get this over with? Tell me the fine so I can pay it and get on with my life." He pulled out a wallet thick enough to choke a horse and slapped it on the podium. The courtroom fell into a stunned silence. Calling Judge Caprio "old man" was a line nobody had ever dared to cross. The bailiffs straightened up, their hands moving closer to their sides. Judge Caprio slowly took off his glasses and placed them on his desk. He looked at Blake, not with anger, but with a deep, profound disappointment that was somehow much worse. "Young man," he began, his voice dangerously quiet, "in this courtroom, we show respect. Not just for me, but for the law, and for the community you put at risk. This isn't a drive-through where you can just pay for your mistakes and speed away." That's when Blake played his trump card. Or at least, what he thought was a trump card. He leaned forward, dropping his voice into a conspiratorial whisper that still carried through the silent room. "Maybe you don't know who I am," he hissed, his smirk returning full force. "My father is chief of police, Robert Henderson. Now are you going to make this difficult? Or are we going to make this little problem disappear?" A collective gasp went through the room. It was one thing to be arrogant, but to openly try and leverage your father's position as the police chief to intimidate Judge Caprio, this was beyond belief. I saw the court reporter's fingers freeze over her keyboard. Judge Caprio's face became a stone mask. He stared at Blake for a long, uncomfortable 10 seconds. The air was electric. I expected him to bang the gavel, to find Blake in contempt, to throw the book at him. But he didn't. Instead, the corner of his mouth twitched. He leaned into his microphone. "Your father is the chief of police?" he asked, his voice deceptively calm. That's interesting. Blake puffed out his chest. Yeah, it is. So, as I was saying, he was cut off. Because that means you of all people should know better. The fine is $1,000 for the violations, and I am suspending your license for 1 full year, effective immediately. Blake's face went from smug to crimson in a heartbeat. The color drained away just as quickly, leaving him pale with rage. You can't do that, he shrieked, his voice cracking like a teenager's. You're a joke, a washed-up TV clown. My father will have your job. You'll be directing traffic in a retirement home by next week. He took a step, then another, moving from behind the podium towards the judge's bench. He was pointing, his face contorted in a mask of pure fury. The bailiffs finally moved, starting towards him, shouting, "Sir, step back!" But before they could reach him, Blake lunged, not to physically touch the judge, but to slam his fists down on the sacred wood of the bench, right in front of the shocked judge's face. The sound echoed through the courtroom like a gunshot. "You're finished!" he screamed. The bailiffs were about to grab him, to tackle him to the ground. The whole room was on its feet, a mix of screams and shocked gasps. I was frozen, my heart trying to beat its way out of my chest. But then, the most incredible thing happened. Judge Caprio didn't flinch. He didn't even look at Blake. He simply raised one hand, a calm, deliberate gesture that stopped the bailiffs in their tracks. He looked past the seething young man, his eyes finding a figure standing near the back wall, a man who had been trying to remain unnoticed in the shadows. "Chief Henderson," Judge Caprio said, his voice cutting through the tension like a razor. "I assume you're here for your son, or are you here about the other matter?" Every head in the courtroom swiveled in unison, a slow, creaking wave of disbelief. My own neck craned so hard I felt a pop. There, standing near the heavy oak doors, was a man I recognized from countless local news conferences. Chief Robert Henderson. He was a big man, broad-shouldered with a chest that strained the buttons of his impeccably tailored suit. He always projected an aura of unshakable authority, of calm, decisive power. But not today. Today he looked like he'd been punched in the gut. His face, usually set in a stern, professional mask, was a ghastly shade of pale, and his eyes were fixed on Judge Caprio with a look of pure, unadulterated dread. He hadn't been hiding in the shadows. He'd been trying to become one. The silence that followed the judge's question was heavier than anything I'd ever experienced. It wasn't just quiet. It was a vacuum, sucking all the air and sound out of the room. Blake, frozen mid-rant, slowly turned to look at his father. The rage on his face dissolved into a slack-jawed confusion, like a child who just realized his invincible superhero dad was, in fact, mortal. "Dad?" he whispered, the sound barely audible. "What's he talking about? What other matter?" Chief Henderson ignored his son completely. With a visible effort, he straightened his tie and began the longest walk of his life, down the center aisle towards the bench. Each footstep echoed on the polished floor, a funereal drumbeat marking the end of his career, his reputation, maybe even his freedom. The entire gallery watched, holding its collective breath. My own little parking ticket seemed like a joke from another lifetime. The chief stopped just behind his son, his gaze locked with Judge Caprio's. The two men stared at each other for a moment, a silent battle of wills playing out over the head of the oblivious boy who started it all. "Your Honor," the chief began, his voice a low rumble, tight with controlled fury and humiliation. "I am here to apologize for my son's inexcusable behavior. There is no excuse for his disrespect towards you or this court." He turned and gave Blake a look so withering it could have peeled paint. Blake visibly flinched and took a step back, finally seeming to understand the depth of the hole he was in. "He will accept whatever punishment you deem appropriate," the chief finished, turning back to the judge. It was a good speech, a perfect delivery of a man taking responsibility. But Judge Caprio wasn't buying it. The judge leaned back in his chair, steepling his fingers. "I appreciate that, Chief, I truly do," he said, his voice soft but carrying a sharp edge. "But you didn't answer my question. Your son's behavior here today, while appalling, is merely a symptom. We need to talk about the disease." He paused, letting the words hang in the air. The other matter, as I called it. The one where a certain silver sports car was involved in a hit-and-run on East Avenue 3 months ago. The one where the only witness, a grandmother on her way home from bingo, suddenly had a change of heart about her statement after a visit from 2 of your most persuasive detectives. Every word was a hammer blow. The chief's face went from pale to ashen. The confident swagger Blake had walked in with had been inherited, I realized, but the father had the sense to hide it better. Until now. I don't know what you're referring to, Your Honor, the chief stammered, but his eyes darted around the room as if looking for an escape route. Blake's head snapped between his father and the judge, his face a canvas of dawning horror. East Avenue? He choked out. Dad, that was... Quiet, Blake, the chief hissed, a command born of pure panic. But it was too late. The connection had been made in every single mind in that room. Judge Caprio's expression didn't change. He simply nodded as if the chief had confirmed everything. He looked past the 2 Hendersons towards one of the bailiffs standing by the wall. "Officer Miller," he said, his voice suddenly loud and clear, resonating with an authority that dwarfed the police chief's. "Would you please retrieve the file from my chambers? The one we discussed this morning. It's marked Henderson, personal. Bring the evidence envelope with it." The bailiff nodded, his face grim, and disappeared through a side door. A wave of frantic whispers swept through the gallery. This wasn't a traffic court anymore. It was an execution. Chief Henderson looked like he was about to collapse. He opened his mouth to speak, to object, but no words came out. He just stood there, a powerful man, rendered utterly powerless. Blake was now shaking, his designer jacket and smug attitude a pathetic costume on a terrified boy. The bailiff returned a moment later, holding a thick manila folder and a large, sealed plastic evidence bag. He handed them to Judge Caprio. The judge placed the folder on his desk and held up the evidence bag for the whole court to see. Inside was a small, mangled piece of silver metal, clearly a fragment from a car, and something else. A single, brown leather driving glove. Judge Caprio looked directly at the chief, whose eyes were wide with terror. "Chief Henderson," the judge said, his voice dropping to an icy calm that chilled me to the bone. "Before I sentence your son for his traffic violations, perhaps you can tell the court why your fingerprints are all over the evidence I personally recovered from a crime scene you declared had none." The silence in the courtroom wasn't just silence anymore. It was a physical thing, a heavy blanket of shock and accusation that smothered every person in the room. Chief Henderson stared at the evidence bag as if it were a venomous snake poised to strike. His mouth opened and closed silently, like a fish gasping for air. The color had completely drained from his face, leaving behind a waxy, translucent pallor. Beside him, Blake looked like he was about to vomit. The whole arrogant facade had crumbled, revealing the terrified, spoiled child underneath. He kept looking from the glove in the bag to his father's hands, the cogs of his simple, privileged world, grinding to a halt and then shattering completely. My fingerprints?" the chief finally managed to croak, the words catching in his throat. It wasn't a denial. It was the last gasp of a drowning man. Judge Caprio laid the evidence bag gently on the bench, his movements slow and deliberate, ensuring every eye was on him. "Yes, Chief. Your fingerprints," he said, his voice as calm and steady as a surgeon's scalpel. "You see, after the accident on East Avenue, the initial responding officer, a young rookie named Patel, found this glove and the car fragment near the scene. He dutifully logged them into evidence. But then something strange happened. The evidence disappeared from the log. The witness recanted. And you, personally, signed off on the report closing the case, citing a lack of evidence." The judge paused, letting the damning words sink in. He opened the manila folder. Fortunately for the cause of justice, Officer Patel was a very conscientious young man. He took photographs of the evidence before it vanished, and he was so troubled by the way the case was handled that he brought those photos to me. A collective gasp rippled through the gallery. This was a conspiracy, a cover-up, unfolding right before our eyes. The chief of police using his power to bury a crime and a rookie cop risking his career to go to the one man he thought he could trust. Judge Caprio. Henderson staggered back a step, actually bumping into his son. "This is outrageous," he blustered, but his voice lacked any conviction. "It's a fabrication, a disgruntled officer." "Is it, Chief?" Judge Caprio interrupted, his voice cutting like glass. He pulled a photograph from the folder and held it up. It was a clear, high-resolution shot of the silver car fragment and the leather glove lying on the asphalt. "Because after Officer Patel came to me, I made a few quiet inquiries of my own. I went to the impound lot, where the victim's car, a 10-year-old sedan belonging to a single mother of 3, was taken. I found this fragment," he said, tapping the evidence bag, "wedged into her rear bumper. A perfect match for a high-end sports car. And as for the glove—" He let the sentence hang in the air, then turned his piercing gaze on Blake. "That's a very distinctive glove, Mr. Henderson. Custom-made, I believe? From that little shop on Thayer Street that specializes in driving accessories. The kind a young man with a brand-new silver sports car might wear." Blake visibly trembled, his eyes wide with panic. He looked at his father, a silent, desperate plea for help. But the chief was beyond helping anyone. He was trapped. The entire courtroom was a cage, and Judge Caprio held the key. The chief's attempt to project authority had evaporated. He was just a man, exposed and terrified. He looked around the room, at the faces of the citizens he had sworn to protect, now staring at him with contempt and disgust. He saw the court reporter, whose fingers were flying across her keyboard, documenting his downfall in real time. He saw the bailiffs, his own officers, who now looked at him not with respect, but with cold, professional neutrality. His world had ended. "The fingerprints," the chief whispered, his voice hoarse. "How?" Judge Caprio leaned forward, his expression a mixture of sorrow and steel. "When I retrieved the fragment from the victim's car, I handled it with extreme care. I knew what I was looking for. Underneath, protected from the elements, were 2 perfect prints. Your prints, Chief, from when you personally removed it from your son's car before you sent it to that private body shop in Cranston, the one owned by your cousin. It was the final nail in the coffin, a meticulously constructed web of deceit, dismantled piece by the folksy old judge everyone underestimated. The chief finally broke. His broad shoulders slumped, the fight draining out of him. He looked old, defeated. He was going to lose his scholarship, he said, his voice barely a murmur. He made a mistake. A stupid mistake. No one was seriously hurt. The woman in that car has had 3 back surgeries and will likely walk with a cane for the rest of her life, Judge Caprio thundered, his voice suddenly booming with righteous fury, shocking the entire courtroom. Her life is forever altered because your son was racing home from a party, and you decided his college scholarship was more important than her well-being, more important than the oath you took. He stood up, his black robes giving him an almost biblical authority. "Robert Henderson, I am placing you under arrest for obstruction of justice, tampering with evidence, and witness intimidation." The bailiffs moved forward, their faces grim. One of them began to read the chief his rights. Blake started sobbing, a raw, ugly sound that filled the stunned silence. His father, the powerful police chief, was being handcuffed in the middle of a traffic court he thought he controlled. It was a scene no one would ever forget. The bailiffs led the now former chief away. As he passed his son, he couldn't even look at him. But as he reached the main doors, Judge Caprio's voice stopped him one last time. "Chief," he called out. The handcuffed man stopped, his back still to the bench. "This wasn't just about the hit and run, was it? Officer Patel found something else in your son's car when he did the initial search, something that wasn't in the official report you filed. Something you took along with that glove." The cuffed hands of Robert Henderson clenched into fists. He stood frozen at the courtroom doors, a fallen king trapped between his past and a future that had just evaporated. He didn't turn around, but his entire body seemed to shrink under the weight of Judge Caprio's final, devastating question. The air crackled with anticipation. We had just witnessed the takedown of the city's most powerful law enforcement officer for a cover-up. What else could there possibly be? Blake, who was still sobbing, looked up, his tear-streaked face a mask of confusion. "What? What else was in the car?" he wailed, his voice cracking. It was clear he had no idea what the judge was talking about. He was just a pawn in a much larger, darker game orchestrated by his own father. Judge Caprio's eyes, filled with a profound sadness, settled on the boy. "You really didn't know, did you, son?" he said, his tone softening slightly. Then he looked back at Henderson's rigid back. "When Officer Patel first looked in your son's impounded vehicle, before you had it improperly released into your own custody, he found a backpack in the trunk. Inside that backpack was a large, vacuum-sealed bag containing nearly 5 kilograms of cocaine. A collective, horrified gasp sucked the remaining air out of the room. This wasn't just a hit-and-run cover-up anymore. This was major drug trafficking. The police chief hadn't just been protecting his son's scholarship. He'd been burying evidence of a felony that carried a mandatory 20-year sentence. My $25 parking ticket felt like a distant, comical memory from a simpler, more innocent universe. Henderson finally turned, his face a horrifying rictus of despair and fury. "He was set up," he snarled, the sound feral. "My boy is not a dealer. It was planted. I was investigating." "You were investigating nothing," Judge Caprio cut him off, his voice cold as iron. He pulled another document from the folder. "You were using your son as a mule. This is a copy of a wire transfer. $100,000 deposited into your private bank account 2 days after the accident. The sender is a holding company known to be a front for the Escobedo cartel." The judge let the paper drop onto the bench. "You weren't protecting your son from a mistake, Chief. You were protecting your own criminal enterprise." The truth, ugly and monstrous, was finally laid bare. The arrogant son, the hit-and-run, the intimidated witness, it was all a frantic, clumsy attempt to hide a far greater crime. The chief had been on the cartel's payroll, and his own son was the unwitting delivery boy. His reckless driving had threatened to expose everything. That was the real reason for the desperate cover-up. Robert Henderson lunged forward, a roar of pure rage erupting from his chest, but the 2 bailiffs were on him in an instant, restraining him with professional efficiency. "You have no proof," he screamed, his spittle flying. "You can't prove any of this." "Oh, I think we can," Judge Caprio said, his voice quiet but final. He held up the brown leather driving glove in the evidence bag one last time. "You see, Chief, you were so focused on wiping your son's car clean of any evidence of the hit-and-run, you got sloppy. You handled the drugs, and then you handled this glove while you were hiding it. When Officer Patel photographed it at the scene, he noticed a fine white powder dusting the seams. He scraped a sample before logging it. The crime lab confirmed the residue this morning. It's pure, uncut cocaine, with your fingerprints all over it. It was over. Checkmate." The chief sagged in the bailiff's grip, all the fight gone, replaced by the hollow emptiness of absolute defeat. They led him away, a disgraced, broken man, his screams and denials echoing down the hallway before being cut off by the heavy thud of the courtroom doors. In the deafening silence that followed, all eyes turned to Blake. He was on his knees now, his expensive jacket covered in dust, his face buried in his hands. His entire world, his powerful father, his protected life, his own identity, had been a lie, and it had been publicly demolished in less than 15 minutes. Judge Caprio looked down at the weeping young man. The anger was gone from his face, replaced by that familiar look of compassion that had made him famous. "Blake Henderson, please rise," he said gently. Blake stumbled to his feet, shaking uncontrollably. "For the charges of speeding, failure to stop, and reckless driving," the judge continued, his voice formal again, "given the extenuating and frankly tragic circumstances that have come to light today, I am dismissing all fines." Blake looked up, his eyes wide with disbelief. "However," the judge added, his gaze firm, "I am still suspending your license for 1 year, and I am sentencing you to 200 hours of community service. You will serve those hours at the rehabilitation wing of Providence Hospital, working with victims of drunk and reckless driving accidents." He paused, letting the sentence sink in. "Your father's crimes are his own, but your actions still had consequences. It is time you learned what those consequences look like. It is time you started to become your own man, not the one your father tried to create. Case dismissed." With a bang of his gavel, it was done. As the court clerk called the next case, my case, I walked to the podium, my knees feeling a little weak. Judge Caprio looked at me, a faint, weary smile on his face. "Parking ticket, son?" he asked. I nodded, speechless. "Well," he said, "after all that, I think we could all use a little break. Case dismissed. Drive safe." And as I walked out of that courtroom, I realized I hadn't just seen a viral video moment. I had seen justice. True, unrelenting, and, in its own way, compassionate justice, served by a wise old man who knew that sometimes, to fix a $25 problem, you first have to expose $1 million crime.